And we do have a question for the audience, and the question relates, I think, more to monitoring. It goes as follows. Have Canadians seen a decrease in the level of toxins in their bodies or in the natural environment over the past few years?
Well, I'll answer that a little bit, and then I'll pass it over to Francis. So there is a monitoring system, particularly I believe it's blood samples that are taken of Canadians. And what I don't know is whether or not it's been going up or down, but I'll pass it. I do know that we do some biomonitoring, and Francis can tell you more.
Yeah, well, obviously toxic substances, they represent a variety of risks and exposure and sources of exposure for Canadians. And also, as Julie mentioned, this is why it's so important for the government to complete these assessments, these evaluations, to determine whether the risk of toxic substances were reduced or eliminated, and also in order to determine whether the government need new action, to modify actions that are in place, or to determine whether new actions are needed. So we noted that the department have in place a system that is called the biomonitoring program. And also, Health Canada could use these data to complete these assessments on toxic substances.
But I don't think we actually looked at the question of whether or not Canadians have seen a decrease in toxics. I think that's a question that we'd have to ask the department.
Yeah.
Thank you. Also on toxic substances, having just completed this audit, in your view, is the government doing enough to protect Canadians from those risks?
So that's a difficult question, because what is enough? Toxic substances are toxic. That's why they're a risk to human health and to the environment. That's why they're put on the list of toxic substances. It's difficult to know what is enough. Our audit looked at whether or not they had set objectives, which they had. And what we found, we went in to see whether or not they were achieving those objectives. And what we found in our audit was that they couldn't show us that they had done any evaluations to find out if all the measures that they were taking were actually achieving those objectives. So let me just try to explain this a little bit. There's an assessment of toxics that's going on right now, of substances. There are 4,300 substances that the government is looking at to determine whether or not they're toxic or not. They've reviewed over 3,300, and to be precise, 31 had been done during our audit. So they're reviewing each substance, and let's say they find a substance and they declare it to be toxic. Once a substance is declared toxic, a couple things have to happen. They have to develop an action plan with an objective: virtually eliminate, reduce use, prevent importation, prevent use in industrial processes. Whatever objective they decide, they determine an objective, and then what they do is they put in at least one measure to control that toxic substance. The measure could be a voluntary code of conduct, code of practice, a pollution prevention plan that an industry develops, and or a regulation. While they have evaluated some of these tools, they don't actually know if overall the objective is being achieved. Do you want to add anything?
No,
that's good?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question on environmental protection this time. Someone is asking, in light of the changes that we were hearing about coming out of Ontario, what is the federal government going to do to protect Ontario and its residents from the changes or removal of environmental protections?
So what I can talk to you about is audits that we do, and we audit the federal government. The provincial governments also play a role in the environmental space, but we don't audit them. And so it's difficult for me to make a pronouncement on that issue because, A, we don't audit the Ontario government, and the whole area of environment is split constitutionally between both levels of government. So what I can give you comments on are areas of federal responsibility. If the province decides not to In this case, I believe it's decided to repeal the Climate Change Act. It's the federal government's would then decide whether or not it imposes, for example, a carbon price in Ontario. That's the extent to which I can answer that question. We don't audit the Ontario government, we audit the federal government, and the audits that we're talking about today are the one on toxic chemicals, where it's clear what the federal government's role is, and the issue of marine mammals. Sorry that may not be satisfactory.
You've mentioned that departments were slow to take measures to protect marine mammals. In the course of your audit, did you find out why the foot dragging? Why were they so slow to act?
Wow. There were so many. I'll answer it a little bit and then pass it over to Elsa. There are so many tools that they could have used. So they have fishing licenses that they could have altered. They have the ability to establish marine protected areas. They have the Endangered Species Act. And really, we didn't see a lot of action until the 12 right whales were found dead in the Gulf, and all of a sudden we started to see things like fisheries closures and reducing the speed of boats. I'll pass it over to Elsa, and then maybe I'll talk a little bit about the park, the marine park in Saguenay, Saint Laurent. Did you get any? Why they were dragging?
We didn't get a firm answer on why they were dragging their feet when we would approach them on a specific update on a specific tool that we were looking at. They would just respond with, it's not finalized. Or the case in point of that example would be the amendments to the marine mammal regulations, where we had asked the status. They just provided us with a quick answer as to what that status is, but no reason why. That's a question for the departments.
Yeah. Sometimes we don't get all the... Sometimes some of the answers have to be answered by the department as opposed to us. We can tell you the what, but we can't always tell you the why. We can tell you, though, that they did establish a marine park in near Saguenay, and it's the Saint Laurent. It's a park that's jointly managed by the province of Quebec and the federal government.
Yeah.
And there they actually established some regulations in that protected area, which showed that they were able to collaborate and they were able to regulate activities in there to the benefit of the beluga whales in that area.